I'm incredibly honored to have our first guests in the studio. We've got Dan Rather, who was the anchor of the CBS Evening News for more than 2 decades and is now the president and CEO of News and Guts. Also in the house is producer Elliot Kirschner over there on the end of the couch, and director Adam Bolt. They are here at South by with a new documentary called Human Nature, which is premiering tomorrow. The film explores the biggest tech revolution of the 21st century, which is called CRISPR, a technology that gives us unprecedented control over the basic building blocks of life. That's a lot. It's a mouthful, and it's amazing. What a way to kick off our show. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Okay, so you are here for a panel about CRISPR, but everyone is also here for the film Human Nature. I think it's probably critical for us to start off and discuss the word CRISPR. It's actually not, I think, what a lot of people think of. Can you guys explain that for me?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So CRISPR is an acronym, and it's not really worth knowing what it stands for because it doesn't have anything to do with what it actually does.
Okay.
And it's CRISPR.
Right.
And what it is it's a technology that allows scientists to modify DNA in an incredibly precise and easy way. Like you said, it's unprecedented. And it came out of research into these very unusual bacteria. So CRISPR is actually this natural process in bacteria that scientists harnessed and figured out how to use it to modify DNA.
Okay, and what this is, it is the biggest story I think I've ever covered, and I've covered a few over the years. I don't mean that in a self-serving way. But what we're talking about here is the ability of humans to edit our genes, to engineer our genes, and therefore to change them in really significant ways, and as Adam has said, in very precise ways and not very expensive ways. But not only can we now, this is happening now. We have a long way to go with it, but it's not something that's off in the future. That's the reason we did this documentary. We want to have a conversation now that we're into this, the ability, think about this, the ability to edit, to engineer not only our human genes, but every other organism on the planet. This is right up there, I think even beyond invention of the internet, talk moon landing, talk anything you want that's mind expanding, in some ways mind blowing, tremendous with promise, but also has its dark side of questions. What am I talking about? The promise. You get inside the gene and remove stuff like muscular dystrophy, sickle cell anemia, all kinds of maladies. On the other hand, it has the ability, the promise, if you will, of engineering babies, blue eyes, height, that sort of thing. So this is, when we say this is the breakthrough of the 21st century, people are going to be talking about this, we're going to be talking about this, and our heirs will be talking about this for generations to come.
So I can tell as a journalist you're very excited about this.
I am, but on the other hand, I excite easily.
Well, this film I think does a fantastic job of taking what can feel abstract and visually telling the story, because it still can be, like I read articles about it and I still was confused, and the film I thought really kind of laid it out for me and really did explain to me how sort of like complicated but yet easy and under our nose the technology is, how it was already sort of pre-existing. And I wanted to know, like, some of the examples, and you mentioned a few of them, but what are some of the other examples of how you can sort of harness this technology?
Well, I mean, what's the thing about life is that all of life that we know of is basically built around DNA and genes. So if you can edit genes, that means you can edit any single, as Dan said, single organism on life. So you could, there's a lot of promise, or a lot of people are doing this to sort of study agriculture and crops, in the face of climate change. Can we make crops that are more resistant to drought? Can we make them more, that can be grown in soil that has more salinity to it, or something like that? So, you could talk about potentially, and this is where it gets to be, pushing the edge of what we should do. engineer extinction of mosquitoes that transfer malaria. That's something that people are talking about. Engineer extinction of invasive species, like on the islands. There's a test maybe of going in one of the islands off of Massachusetts where there's mice infestation, Lyme disease, these kind of things. So it really can. It's basically you could use it for any form of life. The question then becomes, how much do we really understand? How much risks are we going to take? How much humility should we have to have in the face of this technology?
Right. You are, what you kind of alluded to was like, how far should we go with this? And Dan, this film paints a picture of a potentially brave new world, to borrow the title from Aldous Huxley, where we can order up designer kids or create potentially a super race that may be more powerful, than maybe say a nuclear bomb. What are some of the implications of this?
Well, the implications are broad and deep, which is the reason we need to have a conversation now. When we're still on the front edge of developing this, we need to have a conversation about this. Does there need to be some kind of regulation? If so, what kind of regulation? And if you have some kind of agreed regulation to use this new technology, these biological techniques to remove like muscular dystrophy, sickle cell anemia, all kinds of things. If the decision is made, okay, we're going to use it for that, but we're not going to let it go into engineering babies, which, make no mistake, it has that potential to do, then who's going to enforce it? Is it going to be the United Nations? Is it going to be an agreement of countries? You right away fall into what I said in the beginning. There's tremendous promise here, but there's also the dark side that we all know. Adolf Hitler tried to breed a master race. Thank God, and all of the powers that be, he didn't have this new CRISPR breakthrough. But what's called eugenics, which is trying to breed out what are perceived as weaknesses, and to breed in things like blue eyes and height, that sort of thing. This is where the water gets dark and deep. And scientists will tell you that they don't have all the answers. And the scientists are split among themselves about should there be regulation, if so, how much regulation,
Sure.
Who should enforce it, and those kinds of questions. All the more reason that we wanted to do this documentary to start the conversation.
And so there are obviously like very serious implications to this tech, but at the same time, you have some really, really smart, authoritative people who I would trust based on what they've done, who are actually saying the flip side to it, like what are the upsides and what are the positives, and how maybe we shouldn't be quite as scared is all that. But do you think that people should be worried about this tech?
I think worrying about new technology can be a good thing. I don't think that means that people should have a knee-jerk reaction to stop progress. I think the worrying about it is part of a process of figuring out what we as a society want to do with it. I think the potential for good, curing really terrible diseases, that's such a positive. You wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Sure.
so to speak. And I think another thing that's important, I think, is that when we talk about something like the possibility of engineering babies, at least in our society here in America, that's something that would probably come down to a very personal decision for individual people, what they want to do with their own families. And I think one thing we want to do in this film is kind of, before those decisions are right on your doorstep, because the technology is moving very quickly, and genetics and the possibility of knowing more about your genes and what kind of risks are in your genes, and getting potentially a sort of a profile of what a future child might be like. These things are all coming. Most people haven't encountered it in their own lives yet. So I think what we wanted to do in the film is give people a variety of different perspectives on how to think about that.
Yeah. Well, and you also, it's very easy to start focusing on children and babies and our own genetics, but you also point out, Elliot, the big existential threat that CRISPR could potentially, fix, which is climate change, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the question, is like, and if you talk to scientists, like, it's being used in the lab all the time for all sorts of research. So I think for the society, we need to grapple with how we're going to use it, especially on ourselves. But this revolution, as Dan has alluded, it's already happening. It's revolutionized global science, and it's going to have its implications in terms of how do we engineer the world. I mean, that's why we call the film Human Nature, because, like, where do we draw the line between what's natural, what's human, what's mankind, what's humankind rather, and we even trace it back to the early days of agriculture in the film. Right. And you sort of, this idea that there's something about human beings that want us to tinker with our environment. We've been doing it all along, and now we have this really powerful tool.
Yeah, and it's like, for example, I learned that tomatoes were tiny back in the day, and corn used to be grass, and this is way before CRISPR. We turned it into what we know
so
as.
We've been doing this for a long time.
Right, exactly. That to me was illuminating. I had no idea. But I did want to know more about our own genetic information. Like, for example, I have my own DNA through a testing company, and right now it's a novelty to me. But soon I'm sure everyone will. What are some of the pros and cons of just having this information readily available on an app on your phone?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things. One is, a big question is that potentially you might know things about what's going on in your genes that at this point in time you can't do anything about. And so, do you want to have that information before there's the ability to go in and fix it? And CRISPR is expanding the possibilities of what we can fix, so to speak. But, that's a whole process of its own of research and clinical trials for each thing. So that's a question. And then, of course, there's, knowing things that are in your genes that you might pass down to your children if you have children.
Put it this way, that now this was not the case at the beginning of the internet. Very few people knew about the internet, knew about the potential. Now, here in the second decade of the 21st century, if you're not at least conversant with the internet and the World Wide Web, you're left behind. And what this documentary shouts to you, that if you want to be part of the conversation about the future, not only your own family's future, but the future of humankind is not to be, you have to be conversant with what's happening at the end of these microscopes, these breakthroughs with biology. And it'll come down to, for myself, you watch this documentary and you'll be asking yourself this kind of question. If I had a child who had a life-threatening malady, I wouldn't hesitate for a second to say, you bet, use CRISPR, anything for my child. On the other hand, for me personally, I'm saying, I don't think I want to mess with the genes of heredity. I take the point that you could order up blue eyes or over 6 feet tall, but I don't think I want to do that. But these are the kind of personal decisions that everybody's going to be facing in the not very distant future.
Right. And it should be noted that you're talking about two different aspects of gene editing. There's the I can change my genes right now. Yes. If I had I had some illness that that might kill me, I could change that in my own body. But then once I change those genes, that won't be passed along to my children. But then there's also germline gene editing.
I'm glad I was going to bring that up. So a good example is in the film we talk about sickle cell anemia, and we follow a
That's a
teenage boy.
wonderful boy in the film.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's an amazing kid, and he has sickle cell anemia. And in that case, it's what they call somatic editing. So they can actually take blood cells out of his body, and they actually fix the gene that causes sickle cell in a test tube, essentially, in the lab. And then they put those cells back in his body, and the blood regenerates, and it only affects the blood, which is where the disease is in the case of sickle cell. And if that, right now that's kind of in clinical trials, so if that proves to work, then that would be a cure for that disease. But it wouldn't affect, if he has kids, those kids potentially could still have sickle cell and would need that same cure versus what you're saying, germline, which is affecting DNA in cells that do get passed
and
down.
it's just important to know because people can get really scared
really
about this
important.
tech really quickly.
Yeah, and the somatic, what they call somatic editing, I mean, by and large, it's not controversial, at least the uses people are talking about now, although, potentially you could edit, we talk about in the film, there's a very specific gene called myostatin, which affects muscle development. And maybe there's the potential to go into your muscle tissue and modify the genes in the muscles and give you bigger muscles or something in a way that also wouldn't be passed down. So that's a little troubling too.
People are already trying to do that to themselves.
They are.
At home.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I don't know how technical you want to get, but a big challenge with a lot of this, if you're talking about changing the DNA of an existing person, is how do you get CRISPR, this little tiny molecule that goes in and modifies the DNA, how do you get it into every cell of your body that you want to change?
So we're unfortunately running out of time, but I do want to make sure we talk about, there's this interesting point in the film where it might be possible to use DNA to solve crimes, but beyond what we're familiar with. For example, you collect DNA off of a murder weapon, and then from that DNA you might be able to tell the police.
Another thing is, like, once we uncover the secrets in the DNA, we're gonna be able to find a lot about it. We're gonna be able to learn a lot more about what's in there.
Sure.
And so we give this example where you can look at it's not just it's thousands of places on the genome, which shows how complicated these traits are. But height, you could look at it and use sort of artificial intelligence to sort of tell how tall that person is.
Right.
Unless they've been malnourished or anything, but you could just get a sense. So I think that the point is that science moves at a very, very fast pace, and we're going to know more and more and more. And the question is, what this film is asking is, what do we do with that knowledge? How do we process that knowledge, and how does that change our behavior?
Yeah, there was a really great quote in the film near the end, and it goes, "I guess the lesson is that humans are really good at inventing things, but really bad at working out what the implications are." And before we run out of time, I am curious to know what you three think as the filmmakers, and then also someone who's reported on so many technologies for so long, as to what you think might be some of the future implications for this, since we don't generally think out the implications before when we invent something.
Take a swing.
Well, I'll go. I think the thing is that we just really don't know. I mean, it's like we can think we understand it, but when this technology came, it came out of nowhere, and scientists thought it would be ages to figure out how to edit genes and now suddenly nature provided this tool, and bam, we're off to the races. So I don't know really where the implications are, and I think that's why it's so important to have this film, is that we're going to need to talk through each new advance and try to predict as far as we can, but be prepared for the surprise.
What I would say is, I think the future of this technology is in large part going to be determined by what people actually want to do. And I think that can be a cause for hope, actually. We give, briefly in the film, we talk about cloning, when that came on the scene, a couple, decades ago now. And everyone freaked out that we were going to have clones of, and it turned out no one really wanted a clone of themselves that badly. So I think that raises the question, do parents really want to engineer enhanced traits in their children? Is that what having a child is really about? And I think, if you think about that, I think that gives you hope that isn't really what most parents are looking to do.
There's a lighthearted moment where you talk about how essentially yogurt helped us sort of discover CRISPR. And so there are so many implications beyond just editing yourself or a baby that we need.
Absolutely.
How about yourself?
Well, going forward, I think it's important to keep in mind how fast science frequently moves. That sometimes they can't, for example, they haven't solved a cure for cancer. We've been trying for well over 50 or 60 years. But science in general moves very quickly. So when we think about gene editing, gene engineering as we are, keep in mind that science has the capability, particularly in this area, to move extremely quickly. And if you don't keep up with it here near the beginning, it'll be increasingly hard for you to keep up as time goes along. So the kind of conversation of, what do I think about this? Do I think babies could be engineered? Do I think that's a good idea or not? Each individual person is going to have to decide that for themselves in a family setting. And the sooner you start gathering knowledge about this so you can make a knowledgeable decision, the better it's going to be for you and your family.
Enlightening. Gentlemen, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for your time. This
Thank you.
film is fantastic. It's a really good piece of storytelling that I found myself glued to the entire time, and explains this so well. For those of you watching, Human Nature premieres tomorrow here at South by Southwest at 11:45 a.m. at the Adam Theater in the Austin Convention Center. I'd like to thank Dan Rather, I'd like to thank Adam and Elliot for being here today, and thanks so much for tuning in to South by Southwest Live. We'll be live again at noon today, when we'll be joined by Malton on Movies, Leonard and Jesse Malton. Thanks for watching.